Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Good morning, everybody. I was on the way into work today and I was listening to a podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, and he was interviewing and chatting with Sam Altman, who is this guy who's working on artificial intelligence, AGI, artificial generalized intelligence. And they were talking through all of the permutations of the things, the possible things that could happen. And one of those things is when they talk about a neural link is the connecting of a human being to the massive amount of information that's out there in the digital world. And then if someone who's ultra powerful and wealthy gets a hold of that and then is able to use artificial intelligence to augment him or herself, how does this go down? And of course, this is fraught with a lot of different questions, a lot of cautions. Do we end up inventing robots that take over and eliminate the human race? Or do we become some kind of hybrid entirely or almost entirely unlike who and what we are now? But I wanted to address one thing that they were talking about. They were both saying, who knows what that could look like, what that would be for that person. And it sort of struck me that this really relates to intelligence and what intelligence means and how intelligence can or cannot benefit people, and how the use of intelligence augmented by technology has already created this massive disconnection between the poorest of the poor and the most wealthy. And that's always been true to a certain extent. I'm pretty sure, for example, slaves in Egypt and the god emperors, the pharaohs of Egypt, there was a massive difference. But that difference was limited by medical knowledge, lack of technological advances. The pharaohs died of the same things generally that the slaves did, other than maybe being murdered, etc. And so I'm going to share with you my thinking on intelligence and my thinking on intelligence in the environment of artificial intelligence. And I don't know if this is true or not. This is just thinking that I've done forever. So I'm going to start with some of the things that people see as intelligence that I don't see as intelligence. There are people who like to be gatekeepers, right? There are people with good memories. And certainly having a good memory can be one component of intelligence. But I don't consider it a really high level of intelligence, and I'll explain to you why that's true. You get these sort of people who can read a book or learn information or retain that information, and then they like to lord that over people, right? So it's a sort of person who might say things like, oh, you didn't know X, Y, Z. Oh yeah, no, totally. And they always make a big point of letting you know that in this body of knowledge, they have ownership of certain pieces of that knowledge and you do not. You see this in the arrogance of people who speak a language that you don't speak. You can see this in the sciences where people who get off on language can be developed such that it's just not part of the popular lexicon. And people will get off on using language that is not available to anyone else except for someone who's deep in that field. And they will consider themselves smarter than other people. For example, in psychology, there's the concept of allostatic load. Okay, I have a decent memory and I can remember what allostatic load means, and I can use it in front of people, and I can use it with a lot of people who, if you didn't study psychology, you don't know what allostatic load means, right? Simply means emotional charge, emotional negativity, overwhelming experience of stress, such that there can come a point that someone's nervous system is so loaded internally with attempting to deal with overwhelm that it limits their ability, their bandwidth to process events incoming. And that will tend to make them look less adaptive. It will make them look less intelligent. But in fact, it can be the result of allostatic load, right? People who live in poverty often test at a point or two lower IQ in general. And it's not because they genetically have lower IQ. It's because they're dealing with so much stress that when they engage intelligence testing situations, their nervous system and their brain is so overwhelmed with cortisol and concerns that they have to struggle with every day that a lot of other people don't, that all of their bandwidth is consumed attempting to deal with that. Right? So allostatic load. If I were to sit here and act like somehow I have a superior intelligence or I'm smarter than you because I happen to know that, that's really silly. In my opinion, believing something like that is in fact an indicator of having less intelligence, because it's a lack of the understanding of what true intelligence is. So true intelligence, so rather than just talking about what it's not, let's just go into what I view as true intelligence. And I think this is shared by other people. Just having a good memory and being able to retain facts is not intelligence. It's certainly a strong tool. It can stand you in good stead. Being able to learn vocabulary that other people don't have access to and therefore are unfamiliar with does not in any way, shape, or form demonstrate that you're smarter. You see this in, I think, Good Will Hunting, where the main character, who supposedly is truly a genius, mocks and makes fun of the fact that these college kids who go to whatever Ivy League school are able to sort of remember and replicate phrases out of a textbook that they don't really understand and that they didn't do any of the thinking, and they can't even discuss the thinking. And the main character, who supposedly is a true genius, sort of mocks them because there's the recognition that just the ability to internalize some rarefied piece of information does not in any way, shape, or form indicate that you're smarter than somebody else. What it means is you had access to the information, you had access to enough peace of mind that you were able to work on internalizing the information, and you had access to a community that maybe had information that isn't part of common knowledge. None of that indicates intelligence. All of that indicates access and opportunity, and probably involving wealth, right? So what is true intelligence? And then I'll tie it in with what Joe Rogan and Sam Altman were discussing, like what I truly believe would happen if we came to the point that someone could effortlessly access all of the information, not just information, but to access in real time the processing of that information. So in my opinion, and again, I think this is probably not just my opinion, I think this is on IQ tests. I think this is what gets tested on IQ tests. The true measure of intelligence is first pattern recognition. That sounds like a simple thing. That almost sounds like something that you would teach kindergartners. It's like, you know, which of these items is like, which of these objects is like one another, which of these objects is unlike the others. Oh, you have, you know, 4 circles and 1 square. Well, the square is unlike. This is, you're working with pattern recognition. But if you look around at the world, you will understand that you begin to observe that all of the people who clearly are highly, highly, highly intelligent or highly effective and able to leverage their intelligence have an ability to recognize patterns, and they're not obvious, simple patterns that anyone can recognize. And this is what makes it exceptional, right? Everyone can recognize that 3 circles are similar and that the square is dissimilar. That's a super, super obvious toddler pattern to recognize. But someone who operates in, let's say, the stock market, which is incredibly complex, can be chaotic, can be unpredictable, your ability to succeed in the stock market is so complex that if you can even consistently predict 51% of the time, you're basically Warren Buffett. So what is a Warren Buffett doing, or what is someone like that doing? They're able to pull in such massive amounts of data into their mind, into their brain, or into a computer program that they can recognize patterns that other people can't recognize. They can recognize when patterns are false. It's like, oh, this looks like a pattern, but if you look at the much, much longer scope, that pattern fails and so is not predictive and is not safe. And they can find the safe enough and consistent enough pattern that other people do not recognize, that person can then invest in whatever vehicle is sort of following that pattern, and they will be right often enough that they will be incredibly successful. What is a successful football coach? Well, they watch tons and tons of tape or recordings of the other teams, and they look for patterns. They look for predictable behaviors and plans of attack. They also watch their own players and they notice patterns in their own players. Oh, this particular player tends to do really good in the first half, but something happens psychologically in the second half. So this is predictive, and I'm going to begin to pull this player out and sub them out in the second half. Or someone else doesn't do well right out of the gate, but they're really great closers. So this football coach recognizes all of these patterns in their own players and how their own players interact, and other teams and how those players interact. And then they set up a game plan for when they play particular teams. Boxers do this. They'll watch tape of other boxers and they'll look and watch and look and watch and look and watch and look and watch until they see patterns that other boxer may not even be aware that they have. And then that boxer will plan for that, and they'll plan to take advantage of that pattern. And if they do, and they have enough other skills, and they are going to consistently win. Pattern recognition. How many ways do you want to describe this? Teachers. A successful teacher is not necessarily a teacher who knows all the content. Of course, they need to know the content. But what's really happening is they recognize patterns in their students' behavior that allows them to have some theory of mind of their students, of this is where this student is at. And the teacher can then alter how they present the content based on how that child's mind is able to receive the content. This might sound weird. You might think, no, there's, they've developed a system, et cetera, et cetera. Even people who develop systems like, oh, this is the curriculum, this is how it should be approached, are people who have probably spent years, if not decades, watching what works and watching what doesn't work. And then they recognize a pattern of this kind of behavior, and this way of approaching it generally tends to be much more successful and much more helpful. And if I follow this pattern and I can teach other people this pattern, then we're more successful as teachers. Science, right? People think through or imagine or observe patterns in how things behave. And then they attempt to test. I mean, the whole point of someone being able to replicate the test that you do or the study that you do is that if it's not a pattern, if you got one result and no one else ever can replicate that result, then it's likely that you just made a mistake or you didn't recognize some factor that's impacting how this thing plays out, what the pattern is. It's early in the morning, so I'm not doing a great job of bringing up concrete examples. But essentially, true intelligence starts with pattern recognition. And if you ever wonder why success stories always have this frustrating component of people having to fight through the mass of people, including people that are considered powerful and intelligent, not understanding what they're doing. If you're like, why is it? Why is it? Why is it always when someone comes up with something truly brilliant, they have to fight through people saying, no, it's not going to work. And that's not really blah, 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 blah. They push back, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades before they succeed at a massive level. Well, if you think about what you're saying, if true intelligence is this exceptional pattern recognition, where you can see subtle patterns or patterns that are super long-term or patterns that no one else has noticed, I mean, by definition, to succeed and create something that truly contributes, you're identifying something that no one else can identify, that no one else has identified, right? Because if it's an obvious pattern, then billions of people across the planet have already noticed the pattern, and they've already tried to leverage that pattern to create something or to build something or to teach something or to observe. Some people just get paid to just be smart and recognize stuff. Sometimes they advise politicians and they say, well, we've been tracking X, Y, or Z behavior in society, and we think this is the way the trend's going. So we think your speech should be written in a way where you avoid these words that used to be okay, but now society's going to look down on them and you're going to lose the election. That person is just getting paid to observe a pattern, right? So the reason almost all success stories come with this massive pushback is because by definition, someone has recognized something that nobody else recognized. And the pretty smart people and the successful people and the powerful people that they need to go to get mechanisms to make this thing real, to put it into production or to get a movie made or whatever, they didn't recognize the pattern, or they would have already leveraged it. They would have already exploited it. And so by definition, if you truly are brilliant and intelligent and you recognize a pattern that nobody else recognizes, you should just prepare yourself for pushback and for the fact that nobody understands you. And don't make it personal. Don't get all upset and don't feel like, well, nobody listens to me and why is everyone so stupid and blah, blah. No. Like, you're literally like insulting yourself. If you truly have found something brilliant, you expecting everyone else to recognize how brilliant it is defies the very point of your success, which is you're so smart that you recognize some pattern, or you have some unique experience where you recognize some pattern that no one else has recognized. And so by definition, when you begin talking about it and trying to leverage it and turn it into something that impacts society, society's going to push back. That's just sort of a side point that I was going back to, that I was making a left turn on. But to go back to the original point, right? What happens when artificial intelligence becomes a Neuralink? Or forget that, it's already happening that the internet and artificial intelligence provides an enormous amount of data to people who are leveraging it. Why do you think that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and super successful websites no longer really make significant money off of advertising? They do, but what they're really doing is they're observing human behavior through your online behavior, through what you look at, what you react to, what you click on, et cetera, et cetera. And they say over and over, if they're being fairly honest and trying to be ethical, it's all anonymous. It's all anonymous. We don't know who you are. Well, that may be true. That might not be true. I'm not getting into that. But the reason they're doing that is because they're literally looking for patterns. And if they can find a pattern, if they're looking across billions of people across the globe, which we could never do before, we had to do surveys and call people up or go into a grocery store and interview people, right? So, and then you're only getting access to, a certain number of people in the location that you're at. So it may not be representative of overall global patterns. We're at the point now, there are so many people who have access to the internet and interact with Facebook or TikTok or whatever, that the people who make those programs are sitting there watching what you click on. They're listening to what you say. They're logging the sort of things that you say. They're logging what you reject. They're logging what ads you click on. And they're identifying patterns that allow them to leverage. First, they take all that data and they just sell that data en masse. They might sell it to governments, politicians. They might sell it mostly to super global conglomerates, huge companies that are willing to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to see a pattern that no one else can see, because no one else has access to the breadth of that kind of information, right? So they're selling patterns. They're letting artificial intelligence, their algorithms, sit there and log what billions of people are doing, hundreds of millions, probably billions of people are doing, and recognize subtle or not so subtle patterns, and even then begin to have a feedback loop to begin to manipulate those patterns. And at the very least, they're selling that data in order to sell those patterns to people who can leverage it. Food companies, entertainment companies. Again, I would be willing to bet that governments buy this stuff. Why wouldn't you? Don't you want to know what's going on with the population? And this is worth hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, right? But then you go, just the data, right? Just the pattern itself is worth so much. So now you have artificial intelligence that's doing intelligent things. It's showing patterns. It can recognize that there is a pattern. It's showing patterns. It can output patterns. And then a human can look at that, and a really smart human can go, oh, nobody understands this. Now we're the only ones who understand this. We can leverage it. We can just sell the data, let somebody else analyze it and thin slice it. Or if you're the person who buys the data, let's say you've recognized something in weather patterns, as well as human patterns and buying patterns, and you sell that information to a massive conglomerate. Let's say food with preservatives, there's enough information and there's enough data out there that the population is entirely shifted, and it becomes apparent that there's a pattern in people getting to the point that they're no longer willing to buy food with preservatives in the level of sugar that we have in the US, right? So the pattern is out there. If a massive food conglomerate buys that data and recognizes, hey, we're literally at a tipping point. Other people don't really know, but we're literally at a tipping point. Suddenly they have this massive campaign of all organic, all organic, all organic, and all of their brands and all of their child brands and cousin brands or whatever, they're going on this massive pitch that they are all organic and they've changed the face of farming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are they doing? Well, they're leveraging the pattern that they recognized in the data in order to get to corner the market. Because if they can get out ahead of everybody else, then that's worth billions and billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know. I don't know how much money those kind of companies make, those food conglomerates. So it's all about pattern recognition, period, end of story. What we call intelligence, not wisdom, right? Because someone who's wise might say, yes, I recognize patterns, but this is not healthy and I refuse to participate in it. And they might go into the outback of Australia or Alaska, and they might build themselves a cabin and say to truly just meditate every day and just be conscious of like that might be wisdom, right? But what we call intelligence is pattern recognition, and it is the ability to recognize patterns that other people either don't have the time, their brain can't hold enough information to get enough information for a pattern to emerge, or they don't have the intelligence to recognize when a pattern is a pattern, or it's too subtle for them. They're just not into subtle thought or abstract thought. So that's what intelligence is, right? Let's play through one more scenario. What about brilliance in art? Is that pattern recognition? I don't know if it's primary, but I can tell you, as someone who pursued music and guitar playing to a reasonably high level of skill, that pattern recognition is crucial to it. You spend thousands of hours playing and playing and playing. And across that time, you begin to recognize that the way you feel and the way you hold your fingers and the way you execute things has a vast difference for the outcome, how pleasant the sound is, how inspiring it is, right? And you watch other people and you see that there's a way that they approach it and a feeling that they have about it. And then you channel that feeling and you channel that way of approaching it. And the whole point of practice is to internalize a pattern of behavior that results in a sound. Now, saying a pattern might sound so anti-artistic, but I promise you that even though you might not use that language, that's exactly what it is you're establishing a predictable, reliable pattern of behavior, and you're ingraining it into your own brain and your own muscle memory so deeply that it removes blockages, such that whatever you feel and however inspired you feel, that your athletic limits don't get in the way, right? Let's say I feel really into like some hardcore speed metal and like a ripping solo. If I athletically, physically cannot execute that, it doesn't matter that I feel that way. I just can't do it, right? And so, and also if you get into music theory, it's about nothing but pattern recognition, right? Recognizing that there's a system and understanding how the system works and beginning to play inside the system and to work with the system, internalize it so deeply. You know, music theory, it's about a system. There's physics to music. And any musician who becomes truly accomplished has either consciously or unconsciously began to internalize and learn the pattern of how those physics work. And so, yes, even in art, right, the same thing's going to be true of a painter. Like, they have mixed colors and use different mediums so often that they've learned the pattern of how it works, and then they can begin to manipulate and use the pattern to express something that's truly different. They've noticed something different that is a pattern that's pleasant or beautiful or inspiring, and then they use that. Now, that's just the foundation. People would argue in art, there's much more spirituality, et cetera. I'm not arguing about that, but pattern recognition is literally required. If it's not there, consciously or unconsciously, people are not able to create something that's meaningful or inspiring. Authors recognize patterns in human behavior and thought and talk and dialogue, and they may recognize something new. When American minimalism came about, it was these authors that recognized that so much meaning is in simple everyday phrases, and that the phrases we say are not necessarily on the surface always meaningful. They can seem fairly mundane or meaningless, but if you put them together in a certain way that's truly, truly natural to how people talk, that you can evoke or elicit this understanding and this experience, this truly human experience, and you can create great meaning that way, right? Someone recognized a pattern instinctively or consciously. Okay. Enough said on that. Pattern recognition is truly what intelligence is. It's not just memory. Memory can be helpful, but now that we have AI, AI holds the memory. You don't need it. You have access to the information and to the patterns. You don't necessarily need to hold all of it in your head, which is what we used to consider intelligence. So you come back to Joe Rogan and, sorry, who was it? Sam Altman, who's apparently one of the founders and consistently working with artificial intelligence, and saying, what will happen if a billionaire is able to get a neural link, get access to all of the information? Let's say they're already naturally brilliant, a genius. They get access to all of the information available that humans are feeding into all the time, and all these subtle or not so subtle patterns over thousands of years. At some point, it might be 100, 200, 500 years, 1,000 years of information that AI can rip through and recognize patterns. And then that billionaire, my argument, the answer to the question they're asking is like, what would this look like? What would happen? Well, one possibility is that that person with enormous wealth and power would then have access to patterns that the rest of us simply just can't. We don't have the money, right? If you think about the ability to control a whole farm of servers that's able to process an enormous amount of information, and this person is able to have access to it, and then they can recognize patterns, and then they can use those patterns to take advantage, to get out ahead of the human race, and to be fairly predictive about the way humans are going to behave. I mean, it's possible at some point that there will be so much information on humans that a lot of what we do is predictive, not on individual levels, but in group levels. That's already kind of true. If you could really gather all the actual true information of history, I'm telling you this as a therapist, on a group level, humans' behavior is a little bit depressingly predictive. On an individual level, it can be really interesting how humans heal and how they cope and how they respond to difficulty. But on a group level, our behavior isn't that interesting. It's like very predictive. There are just tons of patterns and habits in it that people don't seem to be aware of. That's half of a therapist's job, is to sit there and talk to you and help you become aware of the patterns in your own behavior that you don't see, that hopefully the therapist respectfully says, hey, I've noticed that there's this theme, this trend in how you behave, and naturally this is the outcome for it. Are you aware that this outcome that you don't like is actually a result of this trend of behavior that you seem to be describing throughout your whole life? Are you aware of that? And most of the time people are not. That's why they're coming to therapy. And it's therapist's job to sit there and listen for those patterns, right? So this billionaire is going to have access to these patterns to the point that they could then leverage those patterns to get more control over artificial intelligence and more control over human behavior and more control over resources. It's possible that you could have a person or a group of people who use this to become the greatest pattern recognizers in all of human history. And they could use that for good, or they could use that for ill. Now, a second point here is that this is probably already happening. Just because people don't have neural links don't mean that there aren't people who have access to enormous amounts of information. Something that I've seen happen in my lifetime is there's this particularly intelligent sort of person who might be an MD or a theoretical physicist or someone who then goes and applies their intelligence, their ability to recognize patterns, to whole other fields, and then begins to recognize patterns across fields. And then they talk to the public and they leverage this and they say, hey, you see this in medicine, and that you can take this information and this pattern in medicine, you can take this information in psychology, you can take this information in economics, and it becomes clear that there's this huge pattern in overall human experience. And if you do my system, these 7 steps, you're going to find yourself so much more successful, et cetera, et cetera. You know that there are these people on Instagram, Facebook, all the time now. When I was a kid, those people didn't really exist. A doctor might be considered brilliant in medicine. I mean, they probably existed, but they didn't have a platform to really put that out. But now it's ubiquitous. There are people who talk across different fields. because they have access to so much information. So the point comes back to that there are probably already people or groups of people who have access to enormous amounts of information through the internet, through GPT, through whatever. They can hire teams of people to analyze information, to look for patterns, right? That's what someone like Warren Buffett does. He's trained people, and he has people just watching patterns and predicting. And they may already be controlling human events or manipulating human beings. I mean, this is probably already happening. And so the answer to the question that they posed, Sam Altman and Joe Rogan, what does this even look like, is whether, would it be for ill? Would it be for good? Would there be some people who tried to leverage it for good? Would there be some people who tried to leverage it for power and they didn't care what the outcome was for human beings? But what's going to happen? This is absolutely a foregone conclusion. What's going to happen with AI is that people are going to have access to pattern recognition. They already have access to pattern recognition at a level never seen before in human history. Unless there was some race of people who reached some level of knowledge and technology we're unaware of, and they disappeared, like whatever. I don't know, right? But as far as our known history, what is going to happen? People worry about AI, turning into the Terminator. I don't think that's the biggest danger. I think the biggest danger is already here, that people who don't have to grind, right? They're so wealthy and powerful that they're not spending their day going to work, filling out this report, answering this customer service inquiry, responding to their boss's email, taking a worried phone call from their spouse or their sibling or whoever, racing to the grocery store to pick up their groceries, blah, blah. They're not doing all that stuff. They've made so much money that they hire people to take care of all of their basic needs of daily living. They don't do their own shopping unless they want to. They don't do their own clothes shopping unless they want to. They don't have to do anything they don't want to other than pay taxes. Well, they don't even have to do that other than die. They can spend all their time hiring teams of people to pore through data. They can have access to the fastest computers. They can have a whole farm of servers to sit there and pore through data and recognize patterns that the rest of us, even if we are as smart, even if we're smarter, the rest of us don't have access to the reams and reams and reams of information in which that pattern is hiding. And then they can leverage that. That could be used for good, and that might not. You have people like Elon Musk. I don't think he has ill intent. I think he gets a little bit narcissistic. I mean, if you're that smart and you end up making that much money and you've been that successful, I think you're going to end up being a little bit narcissistic, right? He could use all of his money to really put it into helping preserve the earth that we're on. He believes that that's not really where this is going to go. He believes that we need to colonize another planet, and maybe he shouldn't be able to make that decision by himself. I don't know. Like, maybe he's not narcissistic. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But the point is, there's an example of a guy who's able to process an enormous amount of data and has the intelligence to recognize important patterns, whether that's engineering patterns and how things work and how they could work better, and then choose to do what he wants to do with it, which is to go to Mars. All right. I think I've played through what I meant. I appreciate you guys listening if you made it this far, because I really am cooking my own thinking. So you hear that my thoughts are not super concise on this. But I was listening to that podcast and I got excited because I realized, hey, this is a thing. And this is, if Joe Rogan and Sam Altman wanted to call me up and be like, well, where do you think it's going? Well, that's exactly where it's going. At least in my opinion, it's about pattern recognition, which is the fundamental basis of intelligence. It's about pattern recognition And artificial intelligence will allow wealthy and powerful people who don't have to spend all their time and money just managing activities of daily living. They can spend as much time as they want generating systems to recognize power. They can even patterns. They can even hire people to recognize patterns for them, and then they can leverage those patterns. That brings me to the one thing that I left out, but this is important, so I'm going to tag this on to the end of pattern recognition. There are people who are good at recognizing patterns. I'm pretty good at recognizing patterns, and I have been most of my life, but I was not super successful. And that's because to be effective or powerful, it's not just about recognizing patterns. I would recognize patterns and then argue with people and try to convince them to see what I saw and get super, super frustrated that they didn't see what I saw when I knew that I was seeing a pattern. Okay, great. There's real intelligence. I did very well in academia. It's clear there's a level of intelligence there. Fine. But I didn't have the emotional intelligence to deal with the frustration of the fact that people were not going to see the patterns I saw. To credit myself with like, oh, you see unusual patterns. That just means you're intelligent. That's good. I would just get really frustrated. It was like, why doesn't anyone? Well, it's like, by definition, if you're intelligent and you see a pattern that other people don't see, which is what makes you intelligent, well, people are not going to see it and they're not going to agree. They're not just going to go, oh my God, thank you for pointing that out. You're so smart. Right? So the second step is you have to have the emotional intelligence to, or maybe some level of narcissism, to not give a crap that other people see it or don't see it, and to push and push and argue and push and argue and push and argue and push. And when people are like, you're an idiot, like, I think you're out of your mind. Like, what are you even talking about? People who see patterns that other people don't see hear that all the time. There are lots of people who will, when not getting it, just be like, I don't think you even know what you're talking about. This is some like pie in the sky woo-woo. Well, a lot of people who think they know something, it is BS. And then some people are actually just recognizing a pattern that nobody else is, right? So the second thing you have to have is emotional intelligence, the willingness to understand that you truly do see something that no one else sees, and to only work with people who are able to at least believe in you, or who actually are smart enough to go, oh man, you are on something. I do see what you see. Because most people are just going to think you're full of crap. And they're going to tell you that in one way or the other, nicely or not nicely. And the third part is a stubbornness, a perseverance to build into the world of 4 dimensions products, mechanisms, thoughts, to write articles, to speak on it, to actually build something that reflects what you have recognized in a way that other people can use it, in a way that influences human events. And then you're at the level of a Steve Jobs, right? Or Elon Musk, or someone like Einstein, who maybe never built anything, but he pushed forward his theories and concretized them and made sure that they got tested and continued to talk and debate, right? He put it out into the world. So there's intelligence, pattern recognition, which is great. You can be really intelligent, but if you don't have emotional intelligence, which means you have frustration tolerance, the very basis of emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive other people's mind, thought process, emotional states, and also frustration tolerance. The ability to deal with the fact that the rest of the world doesn't give a crap what you think, whether you're smart, whether you're not smart, whether you succeed, whether you don't succeed. Most people don't care, and most people have no problem telling you that and even being insulting in the telling of it, right? If that takes you down, you're never going to move past intelligence. And intelligence without emotional intelligence adds up to nothing but frustration, narcissism, isolation. And then the third component is almost an irrational perseverance, willing to push and push and push and push and build and try again. And you build something, and the way you saw this pattern, the materials that are available to you, say you're doing an engineering thing and you're just like, I see this pattern. I know if this A, B, and C happens, if I can use this particular chemical in this process, I've seen this pattern that no one else saw, and I know there'll be this different outcome. And then the materials needed to deal with that chemical just don't exist. You're trying to build a new product or a new chemical process, but the materials don't exist. You know, people who invent stuff, probably 75% of the time they spend, or maybe even more, is just trying to find materials and find factories and find money willing to construct materials that can accommodate and help put their idea into action. My father-in-law was an engineer who was quite brilliant. And something I noticed about him, I learned a bit from him, something I noticed about him that was different between he and I. I've always been into pattern recognition. There's been intelligence there. He had this relentless drive to take almost every idea he had and to push through. He and his brothers built a boat. He and his brothers built a plane and tried to fly it, and actually kind of halfway successfully flew it. He ended up recognizing that he started a gold mine and it was mining for years, and that didn't really work out. And then in the process of doing that, he noticed that the way the transmission mechanism on drills worked wasn't nearly as elegant and efficient and strong as they could be. The gears would go out all the time. And so he refined that process, and he did it so successfully that he then created a tooling system. And he had to do this being completely dangerously broke and borrow money, et cetera, et cetera. And he fought through all of that while having children and a wife. And then he ended up finally starting a company where he built water well drills, in which the drilling, the gearing mechanism was so far superior that it was slowly expanding all across South America, all across Mexico, probably would have made it into the United States. Sadly, he passed away. But the thing that he had that I really learned from was this almost irrational, stubborn, relentless insistence on pushing and pushing and pushing and finding materials and asking for this and asking for that, and going and petitioning the government office and going again and again and again and spending months and borrowing money and blah, 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 pushing and pushing and pushing. So if you have pattern recognition, you must then have the emotional intelligence to not care that nobody's going to understand what you're doing. And you must also have this irrational, relentless drive to force physics to organize in a way that allows you to build out your idea in a way that it then inhabits the world and impacts human events. That was important to say, that those components, and then to bring it back to the original point. If someone's a billionaire and they have so much money that they don't really need to care what people think or say, maybe they do, but that reduces the amount of worry. Like, you know, if you've already been incredibly successful, you're probably not that worried about it. But you have the emotional intelligence to not really care what people think about what you're doing. And then you have so much money that, yes, you have to push, but you can just go build a factory. Like, you don't even care. Like, you're not worried about, not like my father-in-law had to fight because he was sometimes fighting out of having lost everything on his previous endeavor. Then he would have to have the perseverance to just fight out of having lost all of his money, you know, generating the money, borrowing the money to start on his next project, in which ultimately ended up being quite successful. But a billionaire doesn't have to do that. So with artificial intelligence, what we have is making pattern recognition available to an extremely powerful and wealthy person who doesn't have to deal with any of the activities of daily living, any of the things that consume our brains create allostatic load that consume our brains and bodies with just trying to go do the laundry. Well, they don't worry about that. They just pay somebody to do that. They can spend all of their time working with pattern recognition and pursuing leveraging patterns that the rest of us don't even realize or don't even see, because they have access to a wealth of data the rest of us don't. And what that means is there can be a person or a small group of people who have a power that has never been seen before. They have leverage. The difference between them and a subsistence farmer in some outback becomes almost the difference between a god and whatever, right? Not meaning to insult subsistence farmers, but the difference in power and leverage over human events is almost godlike. Now, whether they choose to be godlike in a good way or a bad way, that I agree with Sam Altman and Joe Rogan. There's no predicting. All right, so those are my thoughts for today. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.